So we're beginning by just asking everyone to identify themselves, starting with their name and how they identify themselves as being, let's say, academic or activist or artist, shift district or whatever.
Sure.
You know? And you can put forward numerous hats if that's
Sure.
what you want people to know. So
Okay.
you just start with who you are.
Okay. So my name is Miriam Smith, and I'm a professor at York University here in Toronto in the Department of Social Science, but by training I'm a political scientist. And I've been working on scholarship around LGBT politics in Canada for almost 20 years now.
Okay, so beginning with the mandatory questions, the first is if you could tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation.
Well, I think when I first started to do research on the LGBT movement in Canada and LGBT politics in Canada, I started that work in the early 90s, and my interest was in how the changes in Canadian political institutions that had occurred in the previous 10 years, especially the entrenchment of the Charter, how those changes in political institutions had affected the evolution of social movements. And so my approach to what I called at the time the lesbian and gay movement was that I was interested in how this movement had changed and how institutional change was shaping the politics of the movement. And so I took as my time period 1971 to 1995. I went back to the beginning of the lesbian and gay movement in Canada, so-called, and in doing that, I uncovered a series of debates about which I had known little when I started. I knew there was a gay liberation movement, but of course I was familiar with the Body Politic and other institutions of the community that dated back to that period. But I was not aware of really the tenets of gay liberation. And I would say that my connection to something that we would call queer liberation came from my reading about the gay liberation movement of the early 1970s. And when I say reading, I mean reading the queer media of the time, the gay media of the time, lesbian media of the time, reading the Body Politic, the various points of view that were put forth, especially in the early 70s, which I consider to be really the heyday of gay liberation. And in the US that would go back to late 60s, but in Canada I think 1971 is a point of demarcation for the birth of gay liberation. And I think queer liberation is very similar to gay liberation. I think that we are using the term queer in place of gay because gay liberation talked about a lot of tenets that I would consider to be really central to whatever today would be queer liberation. So my connection to queer liberation is via my research and via my interest in and fascination with the gay liberation movement of the 1970s and the importance of that movement to changing gender roles, changes in sexuality, politicization of sexuality that have taken place over the period from the 1960s to the present.
That's great. Can you share with us experiences, and given how you describe yourself, academic or anything beyond that,
Right.
That you've had that you think are significant for how we think about queer liberation,
Right.
As theory or practice?
Well, I think that there isn't a lot of knowledge among the younger generation about gay liberation. I don't think there's a lot of understanding of what gay liberation was all about. So I think gay liberation was really questioning gender roles. And gay liberation was suggesting that our sexuality is plastic and that it can be fluid. And I think that, those were two really important tenets of gay liberation. I think when we say gay liberation, people today tend to think about sort of the movement for gay rights of the 70s, and they have that picture in Toronto. People would think of the Bath Raids, or people might think of Harvey Milk, or people have these iconic images of gay liberation. And a lot of that is about rights assertion. But really, when you dig into gay liberationist thought, and you look at the debates among activists at the time, what you see is that they were centrally concerned about gender, centrally concerned about gender identity, centrally concerned about as I said, the idea that people could be bisexual or that all people could be bisexual. So they weren't just asserting a gay identity or an identity around a same-sex sexual preference. It was much more fluid. And I think that when we say the word queer today, a lot of people, if we look at queer theory in academia, for example, and especially a thinker like, say, Judith Butler, who really emphasizes the performative aspect of gender and is really saying gender is socially constructed and we perform our gender every day when we get dressed and do our hair or whatever, when we get up in the morning. I think that her views about performativity of gender and the kind of queer approach to gender and sex go back to gay liberation. And I think that, the gay liberationists really would agree with a lot of what queer theory is arguing regarding sex and gender. And over time, I think that that was lost from view in gay liberation because of the rights struggle and the focus on legal change and political change. And what happened with that was completely normal and understandable. A social movement arose among a stigmatized minority that was, became politicized. And in order to push for rights for the community and rights for LGBT people, there had to be the assertion, the clear assertion of an identity. And that identity, it's very hard to push for your rights when you're arguing for rights for a plural identity and you're trying to say, we have an identity, but it's very diverse and plural, and we're all very different, and we have all these different subgroups of our community and different identities. It's very difficult to translate that into the political sphere and into the legal sphere. The political and legal spheres demand sort of simplicity, homogeneity, a sort of unitary actor, if you like, rather than a plural actor. So when the movement kind of was, arose and got involved with rights claiming and involved with courts and politics and lobbying and all that, which had happened by the mid-70s, early 70s, mid-70s, and started to make these state-directed political demands, I think that there was sort of a dynamic that was almost inevitable. I think it's a structural dynamic that requires the assertion of a clear-cut, easy-to-understand identity. And therefore, gay liberation, which was really saying, things are very complicated. Gay liberation was saying, this is complicated, this is fluid, who you want to sleep with is or may not be related to your gender expression or your gender presentation. I mean, gay liberation was really politicizing gender in the broad sense. And, but that was lost from view. When the gay liberation movement started to make state-directed demands, it became gay, lesbian, sexual orientation as a category emerged. And I think it's really important to understand that sexual orientation is an invented category. Today people think of, what is my sexual orientation, and it's become really an important part of people's identity. But this was, a created category like other social categories that are created socially and politically. And one of the reasons it was created was for legal demands, because sexual orientation was a basis on which people could make claims not to be discriminated against. They could say, well, I'm going to organize myself around this idea that, the central component of my identity is that I prefer to sleep with people of the same sex and have romantic attachments with them. And that's really the central thing, and that's the central reason I'm being discriminated against. And I'm going to label that sexual orientation and then make claims that I should not be discriminated against by the state, by the government, by an employer, by someone from whom I'm seeking housing, trying to rent an apartment, whatever it might be. Of course, those types of discrimination were commonplace in the 1970s. That was every day of the week. That was the life of LGBT people, was facing this type of discrimination. This was normal. And so just coming out and trying to say this shouldn't be normal, and it shouldn't be normal that I should be fired, it shouldn't be normal that I should have my career negatively affected, it shouldn't be normal that I can't rent an apartment if I'm living with my partner of the same sex, whatever. All these things, as the demands were made, sexual orientation became the shorthand and was legally endowed through court cases and through lobbying, both in the US and in Canada. And of course, we in English-speaking Canada were very influenced by the US development around sexual orientation. And in the US constitutional and jurisprudential legal setup, having a characteristic that is immutable is very important to legal claiming. So then the idea that being gay was, just the way, I'm just born this way, to quote Lady Gaga, that became a very powerful idea. People really cottoned on to that had took that up and said, well, I can't help, sort of the argument, well, I can't help being who I am, so you shouldn't be able to discriminate against me. But that's a very particular notion of rights assertion, and one that, you know, in the US, that's asserted for good legal reasons, because a lot of their law around rights centers on race, and you know, the way that it's been constructed is race is an immutable characteristic, and because you can't change your race, you shouldn't be discriminated against. I think a lot of people would say that's a fairly paltry basis on which to make a rights claim. I mean, people should have rights because, you know, they have rights after all, and we shouldn't have to say, well, the characteristic is immutable for us to be, not to be discriminated against. And the example I always give is that of religion. Religion is mutable, and yet we don't agree that people should be discriminated against based on their religion. So, but anyway, the point is that this idea arose, and it was reinforced through, because, you know, there were incentives in the system, incentives in the legal system, incentives in the political system, for LGBT people to explain themselves to the straight world and to the mainstream world in this way, to have a clearly defined identity, to have a clearly defined set of goals, and around which, you know, we will be pushing forward. And that is, I think, one of the most important reasons that the younger generation today, as I would see it, I don't know how I'm defining younger, but maybe people under 50 or people under 40, I think there's a lack of understanding of what gay liberation was really all about, and that a lot of those ideas about fluidity of gender and sexual preference have, you know, arisen again under the banner of queer. I think the trans movement has really had a huge impact on that as well. But a lot of the times it's like, these are all new issues. Well, no, they were discussed in 1971. You know, maybe not in the same way, but these ideas that gender, for example, as I say, was definitely really central in gay liberation.
That's great. How would you define your role in the queer movement?
Well, my role, I'm just an academic. You know, I'm just a person who does research on this. So I would see my role as being to document some of the stories of gay liberation activists from the 70s. I had the chance to interview a group of people for my 1999 book. I think I interviewed around 20 people, 25 people, and a lot of them were early activists. I didn't interview everyone, but I interviewed a fairly good sized group of people. And I think that since then I've written a second book, and I've written maybe 15 articles or so. So I think I've sort of put the issue into Canadian social science, and you know, obviously I'm one of the people who've done it. I'm not the only person who's done it, but I would see that's my role. I would see my role as challenging the exclusion of LGBT research from mainstream venues, and challenging the exclusion of LGBT topics from research in the social sciences and in history, some of the humanities like history, for example. And I think it's interesting that for me to see where work on LGBT scholarship has been taken up, the disciplines in which it's been taken up, and it's interesting that I think my own discipline of political science is one of the weakest, and I think it's been taken up much more by legal scholars in the humanities around queer theory and thinkers like Butler, and it's been taken up by historians. Sociologists have always been interested in sexuality, and they've always been scholars of social movements, so they've done a lot. And actually, so yeah, it's interesting that I think a lot of the work that has been done probably outside my own discipline, but there's really only one other person in Canada who's a political scientist who has written a lot and done a lot of scholarship on the LGBT movement, and that's David Rayside from the University of Toronto. So there's really not a lot of other scholars coming along who are political scientists who are interested in this particular topic. So one of the things I've tried to do is to target particular journals and particular venues that have never published an article on any LGBT topic. So if we look at political science and public administration, it was really interesting to me that during the 1990s and 2000s, when this was like a topic that was in the newspaper every day, recognition of same-sex relationships, benefits for same-sex couples, discrimination issues, AIDS politics, you know, all kinds of different issues that touched on LGBT identity or the LGBT policy, as I call it, or movement. There was not a single article in Canadian public administration that touch on any topic to do with LGBT politics or policy. And I think in the 2000s, there's been, a decade of the 2000s, or 2000 to 2010, there's been one. So I've sort of seen it as one of the things I try to do is to look at different venues that are really important for dissemination of knowledge in different disciplines, and well, in my own discipline especially, and really try to target those journals and put something into the journal that's on an LGBT topic based on my own scholarship. And as I say, David Rayside has also played an important role in that, because he's also a person who's had the first article in Canadian Journal of Political Science ever on a queer topic back in the 90s. And so I think that these are really important, part of the battle, because this is what students see when they go to university. This is what our society calls our official knowledge, of the world of scholarship, and this is our record of it's one of the most important components of the record that we leave as human beings, is this body of scholarship, which will be accessible to future generations. So the fact that queer voices were completely absent when I began my research, there were very, very few works. There was Gary Kinsman's book. There were a few things, but very, very little about the history, this important history of gay liberation. One experience, because you asked me for an experience that I might mention, is when I was doing the research for my first book in the 90s, I was interviewing different people. One of the biggest issues, so far I've talked a lot about gay liberation, but the other side of the coin that's very important is lesbian feminism and the role of lesbian feminism in the 70s. And I was interested, in the forerunners to the lesbian and gay movement of the present. So when I was looking at state-directed politics, and again, being a political scientist, I was focused on the state. The lesbian feminist movement of that period was less focused on making demands of the state or making human rights demands, and actually was quite skeptical of, there was sort of the autonomous lesbian movement in the 70s that was quite skeptical of gay liberation. And many lesbians in that period were active in the women's movement. So there were sort of three groups of women in the 70s who were politicized around gender and sexuality issues. There were women who were in the women's movement, who may have been, identified as bisexual, lesbian, queer, probably not identifying as queer in the 1970s, more likely as gay women, as lesbians, and then there were people who were involved in the gay liberation movement, which was a smaller group of women, although critically important to the leadership of the gay liberation movement in Canada. For example, someone like Chris Burchill played a key role. And then Marie Roberts and other people. And then there were a group of women who just said, I don't really want to be in the women's movement because these straight women are homophobic, or they're excluding our issues. That they're from the agenda. They're expecting us to be in the closet because they don't want us to come out of the closet, because then we're going to bring all of feminism into question. So there was that group, and then there was the group that established the autonomous lesbian movement. And when I did my research, I talked to people who were from, women who were from from these three different groups. And one of the things that happened is that, they had a foundational disagreement about gay liberation and about the relationship between women, gay women as they might have termed themselves, or lesbian women. Not much of a discussion about bisexuality, which is in itself interesting. But they sort of were questioning, well, what was the relationship between women's interests and the gay liberation movement? And they saw the gay liberation movement as male. Some of them saw it as male and as having nothing to do with women or lesbians, or, whereas women who were active in the gay liberation movement, of course, did believe that gay liberation was about women, it was about lesbians, it was about bisexuals, it was about everyone. And so that there was a divide there. And I think that's very interesting in terms of the fact that gay liberation is often seen as a male movement. And so I think that's an important experience that I had doing those interviews that caused me really to think about, what is gay liberation and what is its relationship to gender? And is it inherently male? Is it inherently gay male? Or not? Given the kind of view I've given you, I don't believe that it was. In its original philosophical beginnings, I think it was something that was open. I can understand why some women felt that gay liberation became a movement that reflected a male-centered agenda. But I think when we go to its origins, it's much more complicated than that. So that was kind of an interesting, salutary educational experience for me.
Very much so. I mean, I'm glad you brought that in. So it's great to have that perspective there as well. Yes. You may have covered this, and we can move on if you felt like you've said enough about it, but how would you define queer liberation? In this case,
Right.
it's queer liberation.
Sure, understood. How I would define queer liberation? Well, there are two possible definitions in my view. The first would center on the points that I made about gay liberation. Queer liberation would be a view that gender and sexuality are fluid. And certainly it would, queer liberation would be the idea that we should be liberated to pursue, same-sex relationships if we wish, or opposite-sex relationships, or both, or polyamory, or whatever. And that, but also that gender and gender identification, gender expression are fluid, and we may move throughout our lives from one position to the other. We may transition from one gender to the other. Would also include the belief that there's a third gender, there's a third way, which is neither, or that we may identify as gender variant, but not as wishing to transition, or not wishing to support the idea of a gender binary, or strict any type of definition of gender. And so I think that those are all beliefs that are associated with queer liberation. And I think it's queer liberation is about bringing about change in society so that these ideas about sexuality and gender are accepted in the mainstream, that they become integrated into how our society functions, that they become normalized. And that, because as I said originally, I think gay liberation believed that, based on things like the Kinsey report, which is very influential at the time, all people are bisexual, for example. So I think queer liberation would have that idea that sexuality is fluid and can be fluid, and that part of the change that queer liberation wants to bring about is to eradicate the line between queer and everybody else and not queer. I mean, when you have a concept, you have to have the not concept. So if we have the concept of queer, we have to have what's not queer. So I think that queer liberation is aiming for the abolition of queer. It has to do that. If it's going to be, liberate, then it has to be moving towards the eradication of the line and the integration of these beliefs and practices around gender and sexuality to the whole society. That's the first view. The second definition is that queer liberation is about protecting the rights of queer people and communities. And I think in everyday parlance, oftentimes people use the term queer. They're just really talking about what would have been called in the 70s the lesbian and gay community, and using the term LGBT, LGBTQ, queer is a handy umbrella to get us out of the alphabet soup. So I think a lot of people are using queer to mean that. And so if you said queer liberation, I think some people might view that as a rights defending strategy. And that's very important, because I think that in that second view, we can elaborate that to the protection of the culture of the queer community. So in the second view, I think the rights claiming, rights asserting could be part of it, and that rights claiming would fit there, and could be fit under queer liberation. Some might place it there. Perhaps the more important point in terms of the definition of queer liberation is the idea that some queer liberationists may see their goal as the protection of queer culture, or queer cultures plural. And that perspective would therefore not be aimed at the eradication of the line between queer and non-queer, but to the contrary, it's preservation, the preservation of that line, and the preservation of that distinct identity. And I think we see that in a lot of struggles around censorship, sexuality, lots of different issues. A lot of the debate around same-sex marriage, what are people really worried about? And I think that one of the things people are really worried about is the loss of culture, the loss of a cultural identity, the loss of the subculture, the many subcultures, and how those are in transition and how they're changing. And I think that there's a cultural identification to being queer that is, or identifying as queer, that I think is very, can be understood as a form of cultural identity. And that then brings up, the question of how queer liberation could be compared to other groups in society, and not just the usual, kind of race, gender, class discussion, which is very important, is another whole topic, but to groups like religious groups in Canada, to linguistic minority groups, to multicultural groups, to any type of group that seeks within Canadian society the protection of its own identity. And in that sense, if queer liberation went down that path, it would be seeking not just the traditional rights claiming with which we're quite familiar for the last 15 years, but it would be saying being queer is a cultural identity that we want to protect, and we want to protect the institutions of the queer community, or communities plural, that fulfill those functions, and have the rest of society understand this is not a minority group. This is a rich and diverse community with complex institutions that have existed for 30 or 40 years now at least. I mean, some could be traced back to the homophile movement. This is a community with a rich history. I mean, this is a community that's deserving of recognition, cultural recognition, and perhaps how that might translate out into policy. But I think those are two fundamentally different views of what we might mean by queer liberation.
How do you feel? Which way do you feel we should go, or which way do you feel that we'll go? Because you seem to sound like, and many others that I've talked with, the second view is that we are a culture, we want to preserve that culture.
Right.
And so do you feel that that's the way that things should go, and that we are going?
I think it might go in both directions, in the sense that yes, I think there is a group I think there is an impetus in queer communities to that assertion of cultural identity. And I think that will more and more be the case if certain rights issues are resolved. So I think that some of the debates that have been going on post same-sex marriage are along those lines. For example, the idea of really addressing bullying in school, and the role of queer youth, with sort of campaigns, the It's Going to Get Better campaign and things like this. On the other hand, I think there's also an impetus for the first view, because I think society is changing, and I think society is recognizing more gender and sexual variance, and that is becoming more the norm, and more. So I think that both things could occur simultaneously. I think that's what I see right now is happening. I mean, that's a big sociological question. So I wouldn't view it in terms of what I would personally favor. I mean, I personally, want to see the survival and flourishing of LGBTQ, community institutions. Personally, I don't want to see that being lost, or that distinctive culture being lost. But I think it is in transition. I mean, I know more for women than for men, but I think it's in transition. And the whole rise of the trans issue in the last 10 years is really symptomatic of both of those, because one of the biggest places where we see in mainstream society the whole issue of gender being discussed is around gender variant children. That's a huge issue that's come to the fore more and more. So I think that we will see that. And with regard to the question of cultural identity, I think in some ways trans identities have been threatening to. There's the problem of pluralism in the queer. The queer community is not just a happy place where everybody gets along. There are plural identities, and I think there are tensions among identities in that idea of cultural recognition. And again, that will complicate demands for cultural recognition. It goes back to the point I made about when the movement started in the beginning, making demands of the state. The rest of society can't understand. You're coming to us and saying you want to be recognized, but you're saying you have 5 identities here. That's going to be, so that drive for cultural recognition, and so we may see a fragmentation where we have particular subcultures, like particular trans subcultures, or particular gay male subcultures, or whatever the case may be, that are making different demands for cultural recognition.
I'm going to go off script here just for a second. You've hit on, this is really interesting, because you hit on the issue of cultural recognition and protection. And in some ways that also speaks to some of the direction of the movement of late. So our community-based partner in this is Queer Ontario, and as we know, it came about as following the dissolution of CL Group. Yeah. And one of the drives for that group is based on a certain degree of frustration and concern with the LGBT movement itself, in the sense that, so I'm going to bring in this concept of neoliberalism, in the sense that the movement has committed itself, partly expected in mainstream society, to reach equality kind of thing. And then there are others who see themselves as more progressive or more radical, who say, it's not just about that for us, it's the celebration of our difference, our diversity, which aligns itself to what you're talking about, a cultural distinction.
Absolutely.
From mainstream society. And so, any thoughts around how this concept of neoliberalism plays into these two definitions you were just talking about?
Well, I think it plays into both of them because
Actually, if I can ask you to just work in the word neoliberalism. So,
sure.
yeah.
How does neoliberalism affect all this, one may ask? I think it affects it in a number of different ways. I mean, of course, we're living in a time where politics at the federal level is quite right-wing. But I think more broadly, we're living in a society that really has been neoliberalized, as many scholars have argued. And what's meant by neoliberalized there is, I think, in terms of the individualization and responsibilization of individuals in society for whatever problems may be there. And I think we do see that in the second definition, the second view of queer liberation that I gave, that does run the risk of being commodified. And it does, that's a long-standing issue going back to the 70s, the commodification, especially of gay male culture, and it just becoming a consumer product, and you kind of choose an identity like you're choosing your clothes, or it's just like another community, you choose to buy a Mac or a PC. It's just kind of like a consumer choice, and you define your identity through sort of consumer choice. And some of the arguments about the plasticity of gender identity can kind of fall into that it's just like a drop-down menu, and it's sort of the drop-down menu society, I always call it. You can kind of get into that situation, and I think that the first definition of queer liberation that I gave is aiming at that integration into society, and it does run the risk when you integrate into society that you're going to be shaped by the society into which you're integrating, and that you're going to be changed. Who you are is going to be changed through that process of integration. I mean, if we took the example of bullying, in a way it's a great issue because it's sort of a foundational experience. It's, when you're in school, when you're young, that's when you start figuring out, whatever ideas about your sexual identity, your gender identity. You're very vulnerable. There's like a different set of rules that govern school. You're allowed to bully people in school, whereas in the rest of society, you're not really allowed to bully people in the workplace, say. I mean, it happens. Of course, people are bullied in the workplace, but, there's at least a prohibition against it in the workplace, whereas in school, it's usually, until these recent campaigns, it's been a kind of a blind eye issue. So, is that a question of radical social change? Is it a question of cultural protection and defense? I think we see both at play in bullying. We see both the LGBTQ community saying it wants to protect its own, and a move to protect, so sort of a move for cultural protection towards these young people. At the same time, we see the movement demanding that school boards and the rest of society recognize that this is unacceptable. But what's interesting about that is it's a lot of people in the rest of society who are also demanding that, like the parents of these kids. So I think that that's where we see a real shift in gender and roles and ideas about sexuality that is occurring, is in the middle of occurring, is that these kids are really, some of them are alone and are rejected by their families, and for sure. But a lot of these kids do have parents and friends and communities who are trying, perhaps, not able to succeed, but trying to protect them and value that protection or demanding that protection. So in that sense, I think we see that occurring. Now, what's the relationship between this and neoliberalism? I think that it is a question that doesn't really foreground social inequality. It's neoliberal in the sense that it's just about how your kid is being treated in school. It's not asking, what are the broader social systems that create schools in which gay kids or queer kids are bullied? What are the other issues? How does race play into this? How does class play into it? Any decent social analysis would tell us that they're going to be very important. And some of the most important cases of bullying, one of the big cases that happened in BC was a South Asian boy who was bullied in school for being gay. And he wasn't gay, but he was being bullied for being gay. So there's a question of the importance of gender expression, the importance of race, because he was also, of course, kids were also making racist comments to him as well as making fun of him and bullying him for supposedly being gay. So, we can see the complexity when we look at these issues and when we look at how social inequality plays itself out in schools of fulcrum, public schools, all schools, for, how social inequality plays out and how social injustice plays out. And the bullying campaign isn't dealing with that. It individualizes things by sort of saying, well, it's this individual that bullied this other individual, and it kind of solidifies neoliberal beliefs about individualization and responsibilization. And so I would see that in some, that the relationship between neoliberalism and queer liberation is very complicated.
Indeed, it is. Okay, so we're gonna, did I skip something here? Oh, okay, yes, just one more of the mandatory ones. How is queer liberation expressed in your work?
Well, as I said before, I just think through documenting and, challenging the exclusion of queer scholarship and scholarship about queer issues. That's basically where I would say my contribution lies, my humble contribution.
All right. And then we now move into the questions that you asked, to be asked. And the first category is history. What can queer liberationists learn by looking at our past?
Okay, so as I said before, I think that there needs to be an understanding of the origins of gay liberation and the ideas about sexuality and gender that were put forward by the early gay liberationist thinkers. At the same time, though, I think that one really important lesson that we can learn from the past is the importance of looking at the process of racialization within queer politics and within the queer movement, because when we go back to the gay liberation movement of the early 70s, one of the things about that movement in Canada that's quite important is that it was, all the main organizations were dominated by whites, and there was very little discussion of issues of race. And organizations quickly emerged among different multicultural or racialized communities, sort of in reaction to this, or as the gay liberation or lesbian and gay movement emerged, especially community organizations serving different urban communities started to emerge. Gage in Toronto, many other groups that are very well outlined in Tom Warner's book. I think he does a good job of outlining the different groups that emerged. And so I think that we have to look back and think about how the question of race plays out in gay liberation and queer liberation, and in particular the role of white elites in relation to this movement, and how the issue of race has or has not been foregrounded, and the process of racialization, because oftentimes we do see that claims that have been made around liberationist agendas do racialize, present a racialized view of Canadian society, present a racialized view of issues, and I think it's important to be self-critical, and by looking back at gay liberation and how gay liberation was not, perhaps one might say understandably for the time, but was not critical about those issues. It's also interesting to, I think another lesson we could learn by looking back is how the gay liberation movement of the early 1970s dealt with the Quebec issue in social movement mobilization, because the movement arose also in Quebec, and there were a whole set of relationships between activists in Quebec and the rest of Canada, and that really weakened over time, and Quebec kind of went off in its own direction, and most people in the rest of Canada have very little idea about what's going on in queer movements in Quebec. And I think that that's something that could be very interesting in terms of looking back at the history of gay liberation, is to see how there was an acceptance of pan-Canadian identity. There was an an acceptance of the idea that Quebec and rest of Canada activists should work together, and a recognition of Quebec's national status by the rest of the gay liberation movement, and so that there were good partnerships that were developed. I mean, it wasn't a rose garden either. I'm sure when we talk to Francophone Quebec activists, they wouldn't see it as any kind of a perfect relationship, but at least there was communication and some institutionalized links. And I think that that's something that queer liberation today can think about. What, how does the issue of queer liberation look from a different cultural perspective? Because Quebec offers us within Canada a different cultural perspective, one that views, of course, Francophone culture, French culture as being central to Quebec identity, but also distinctive and different patterns of multiculturalism from what we find in the rest of Canada. So those are all issues that, looking back on gay liberation, we can sort of pick up for queer liberation.
Great. Now, a very specific area in your work and in your writing is the category of rights-based claims, troubling equality. And you chose the question, is there a tension between the pursuit of legal rights and social rights?
Yes, so I think that I wanted to highlight that bifurcation, or those two concepts of queer liberation that I put forward, the idea of integration and the idea of protection of cultural identity. So I think over time, what I've argued in my scholarship is that the movement was drawn into the legal battle and that it was conservatized by its engagement with the legal battle. Because engaging with law and politics, as I said before, it causes us to organize around a particular definition of identity that will be comprehensible in law and that will be comprehensible to the rest of society, no matter how false that category may be as a kind of assertion of unitary identity for LGBTQ communities. So, and I use the example of sexual orientation being a category it would be an example of that, a category that was invented for the purpose of legal rights claiming. And I think that points that have been made by many other scholars, engaging with courts and with constitutional rights is very challenging for any emphasis on social rights. It tends to privilege, again, the individual's rights, and our Constitution and our legal structure doesn't protect social rights, or at least doesn't protect social rights very strongly. We don't have any rights to welfare, to income, to housing, to health, to any type of, whatever we might define as social rights. Those are usually the sorts of social rights that are included. Other countries' constitutions do. The UN recognizes those types of social rights. We don't recognize any right to economic equality, housing, education, anything beyond the constitutional protection of education rights for official language minorities that we have in the Constitution. So because of that, when you're coming up as an activist and you're making demands out of this constitutional structure, you have to find, how can we shoehorn ourselves in to a very complex, deeply rooted, legally and historically deeply rooted constitutional structure. And in doing that, given what our legal and constitutional structure is, and given that it doesn't recognize social rights, individual legal rights are going to be privileged, and social rights are going to be marginalized. So in that sense, I think that it's important not to blame people. I mean, one of the things that bothered me most about the debate over same-sex marriage is that there would often sort of be recrimination about activists that were involved on the side of same-sex marriage, or even, the individual plaintiffs or the lawyers, and I remember, I think it was Gavin Kirby from Extra West that wrote a very critical article one time about John Fisher, the then leader of EGAL, over the same-sex marriage issue. And I think the thing is, again, these are structural dynamics. I mean, it's not that anyone set out to say, let's claim rights, and that will be conservative, and on the contrary, I mean, in my first book, I really tried to highlight how smart the early leaders of gay liberation in the 70s were in their use of human rights rhetoric. I mean, they knew that when they brought cases, excellent example is the Damien case here in Ontario, where Damien was fired, and then that was contested by, I'm saying the gay liberation movement. This was a very small group of people at the time, a very small group, and this was contested, and they knew they were going to lose. And the same is true of other legal cases that were taken up in the same period, the Doug Wilson case, the ADGQ case in Quebec. There were a series of these cases that occurred where there had been clear incidents of discrimination, and a gay liberation group decided to take it on well, how could I forget Gate Vancouver against the Vancouver Sun, which was the first case to reach the Supreme Court of Canada on gay rights. And that was over whether or not Gate Vancouver had the right to advertise in the Vancouver Sun newspaper. The Vancouver Sun said, no, you weirdo gay liberation group may not advertise in our family-oriented newspaper. And it ended up in the, I mean, I shouldn't laugh, it wasn't, I guess, too funny at the time for the activists of Gate and for, you know, the state of the community. But anyway, it ended up in the Supreme Court. So this, these sorts of cases, you know, people knew that the cases were gonna probably not be successful. And, but they undertook them in order to bring the issue out of the closet and to cause the rest of society to be confronted by this issue and to have to react. So their purpose was quite radical, if you like. I mean, it was quite frightening to do this at this time. I mean, I think it's really captured in the video of the 1971 demo where Charlie Hill is speaking. And you can see the rain is pouring down on their heads. I mean, there aren't very many of them. They're a poor beleaguered group, you know, standing there. It wasn't that easy to just come out and stand on Parliament Hill and come out in 1971. So I think that this was really coming out with such a political act, coming out in any form, standing in the street saying gay is good with a sign, you know, smash heterosexual imperialism. That was some of their signs that they held. I love that one, smash heterosexual imperialism. You know, so I think that was that they were doing that that's an example of kind of the first category of queer liberation, but back to gay liberation that I mentioned, the challenging mainstream society for acceptance and inclusion and for rights recognition. And so they, you know, they really were taking that, on. But, you know, they weren't just blindly using rights. You know, they weren't just sort of saying, we just want to be normal, or we just want to be a nice little couple in front of the TV or whatever, like every other nice little couple, and we want to have the same rights. They weren't saying that, and I think that the fact that over time that legal rights took on a life of their own. I mean, there are structural factors that were determining that, and the structure of, you know, our existing laws and constitution really incentivized the kind of same-sex marriage strategy. And it really didn't matter what leaders of the movement had to say about it. I mean, this is what bothers me about the recriminating with activists that pursue same-sex marriage. I mean, it's not like these activists sit on top of the queer movement and say, we're going to do this or we're going to do that, or, you know, people would always criticize the same-sex marriage movement saying, well, you're prioritizing the wrong issues. Well, it's not like there's a think tank of people who sit around scratching their heads saying, what should the LGBTQ movement be prioritizing this? You know, these are people in society that are having a movement that are, you know, people were demanding the right to marry. They were going and challenging. I mean, the whole Quebec case got started because two guys decided they wanted to, you know, they didn't care what people in Toronto thought, or people in Vancouver, or they didn't care what John Fisher thought, or Egal, or what Gavin Kirby, I think I'm getting his name wrong, it might be Gareth Kirby. They didn't care what Extra West thought about them. They wanted to get married. So that's the thing about legal change. Anybody can go to court and file a case. A social movement cannot control who's going to litigate. And so I think a lot of the discussion was really, a lot of the recriminations in my mind were based on really ascribing to activists a freedom that activists don't have, a freedom to make choices that actually is illusory.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah, well, that's good. And you know, Miriam, that even helps me to hear that, because she knows where I stand with some of this stuff. So.
Just as an aside, you know, there's a great article by John D'Amelio, where he goes absolutely ballistic over same-sex marriage in the U.S. and accuses, you know, how horrible these people are and divorced from their queer roots, and he goes into our culture, you know, sort of our culture will be destroyed. But he also says, you know, this is going to cause a backlash. Like he says, you've raised the issue of same-sex marriage in the U.S., and all you've created is a great big backlash and the passage of all these superdomas, and now people have fewer rights than they had before you started pushing for same-sex marriage. So, you know, you're naughty, 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 you activists who did this terrible thing to us. And, you know, 10 years later, he's been proven completely wrong. As I predicted in my 2008 book, same-sex marriage is going to come to the U.S. And it is going to come, and it is coming. And John D'Amelio, just in my opinion, looks stupid now because it was a dumb argument. I mean, yeah, there was a backlash for 5 years. And now same-sex marriage is bursting out all over the place, and these superdomas are being challenged, and now there's the Prop 8 case, the Prop 8 case going to the Supreme Court of the US. I mean, it may not succeed, but nonetheless, there's no question that there's been a tremendous opening on LGBTQ issues in the US as a result, in part, not solely as a result of same-sex marriage drive, but in part as a result of that. So it's much more complicated. And I feel sorry for these activists getting yelled at, but but that's an aside. You guys don't have a cold Diet Coke, do you? No.
No.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Would you like me to do
Do you want something? We can get you a drink. How are we doing for?
Maybe anything or water would be fine. Oh, listen, I have,
Would you like a juice?
no, water would be fine, yeah. Or a cold Diet Coke if there is one, but if not, can I keep talking? Can we keep going in the interview? We need her.
I think we can. I should have just checked, but I think it's running, so I think we can. So we'll just carry on some terms of time, as long as you don't feel like you're getting too dry. Yeah, let's carry on with the next categories. Intersectionality. Does queer liberation intersect with other social vocations? And we give a series of examples. You can speak to these, you can speak to others, whatever you choose, such as race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, disability, class, etc.
Well, I would say gender identity is integral to queer liberation. I think gender identity and gender expression and gender is the core of queer liberation. So I see the kind of sexual preference, sexual identity, sexual orientation, whatever term you want to use, as, it's also there, but I think that it really is principally all about gender. And when we look at how, just taking the example of gay men, how gay men have been treated, a lot of how gay men are treated is not about gay, or at least one cannot separate gay from gender, because a lot of the whole, a lot of homophobia is motivated by other people's gender identity and how they reinforce their own gender identity by beating up on gay men, metaphorically or unfortunately, really in reality. So I think that gender is very, that's the challenge that queer liberation really poses as a challenge of gender, and a challenge of gender relations. And so I see that as being integral. With respect to other intersectionalities, I mean, of course these have to be part of queer liberation, because people who are part of queer liberation experience these other identities and share in these other identities. So I think that the question is, how does queer liberation take these other intersectional grounds into account? How can queer liberation make these central to queer liberation, taking the issue of racialization, or of the issue of the culture, multiculturalism? I think that that's one of the ways in which queer liberation has to be plural, and has to recognize plural communities and plural ways of being queer, and just plural identities. Again, though, I think the problem is that when the movement tries to speak to the rest of society, again, that same problem arises, where it's sometimes hard to communicate that complexity, and that's built into the political and legal system, and that it's going to be difficult to put forward that complexity. So therefore, again, as in what I said about same-sex marriage, I think that when particular issues are put forward, there can be critiques that an intersectional perspective was not taken up. At the same time, it may be very difficult to take up an intersectional perspective because of this political and legal context. So there may be a dynamic in play that is prioritizing gender and sexual orientation as the central identities of queer liberation, because that's kind of being demanded by the larger system in which queer liberation is either trying to live within and protect itself on the one definition of queer liberation, or that it's trying to challenge and transform on the other side. So I think that that's where the complexities lie. And of course, queer liberation in the two different definitions that I've given may be an idea that simply doesn't fly with many people in the community. So, and they of course have the right to define their, their culture in relation to the community as they wish. So I can see people falling outside of queer liberation, i.e. people with disabilities, people of particular,
Whoops. Sorry. Yeah.
oh my God, it's a Coke Zero. You're a genius. Thank you very much.
I kind of bumped the camera when I got the door, so you might want to just check.
Is my Coke too much in the picture?
I think you're cut off.
Okay.
Yeah. You look very academic, very professorial.
Well, that's important, Nick.
Yes.
I don't want to look like an ordinary person, God damn it. Just kidding. Okay.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, you were.
So I don't have any really good answers on that, basically, in a nutshell. I think it's really important, but God knows. Yeah. I mean, as a white academic who works in a multicultural, multiracial university, I'm constantly thinking about white privilege all the time. And it's not really that easy to know sometimes how to negotiate that. So I just think that really the only point I can make is that I think that when queer communities are dealing with the non-queer community, there's going to be a tendency for the non-queer community to see the queer community in terms of gender and sexual orientation, and not in terms of race, class, disability, or other intersectional grounds. So I think that that's going to be something that is going to be pose a challenge, absolutely. And I think there's a clash right now going on that's really interesting between, I think it really centers on the issue of transnationalism. And I think that might have been one of the other points that was going to be raised in a later question. I'm not sure. I should talk about that now.
Let me just do a quick check. Is there a different discernment from this evolutionary idea or theory that you see as important to our queer liberation as movement? It's probably going to come up in the last one.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So
Okay. So I
that's
think
fine.
I'm going to keep moving because of time.
Yeah,
and
sure.
stuff. So this does take us to our. Just write this out. Privilege. The category of today and tomorrow. You chose two questions there. The first is, are there aspects of queer liberation that you consider to be detrimental or a disservice to the movement? So this is in essence, it's not
Right.
to, if we were going to be accused of being, promoting queer liberation in the documentary, I'm making room here for us to say there can be downsides to anything we
Sure.
do. And so do you see anything as being detrimental
Right.
or a disservice to the movement coming from
Right.
this perspective?
Okay, well, so I would say with regard to what might be detrimental in the idea of queer liberation, or what might be problematic, cause for reflection, would first of all be the extent to which a concept of queer liberation, no matter which concept it might be of the two that I laid out, however we might define queer liberation, do all people in the LGBTQ community actually adhere to anything that's even an approximation of these ideas? Is this being defined by the elite of the community, by its political organizations, or is this actually something that is shared, widely shared? I think that advocates of queer liberation have to be clear on who's being marginalized by the use of that term, who doesn't agree with it, who doesn't identify with it, and what is their perspective. So before I cited, there might be people from particular national backgrounds, religious backgrounds, just disabled people, any people with disability, any other type of identity, people for whom, class and social inequality is very important, who just might not share in the idea of queer liberation. I think the idea of queer liberation centers gender and sexuality, and for some people, even though they might be gay, even though they might be trans, even though they might be bi, whatever, that's not the biggest issue in their identity on a daily basis. They may have other things that are much more important to the way they define themselves. So I think that queer liberation has to be careful not to be imperialist, colonial and imperialist in defining itself as being the total theory of everything, or whatever, which is challenging because on the one hand, the movement wants to recognize intersectionality. On the other hand, I think there has to be a recognition that not everyone may believe that the goal should be to protect LGBTQ cultural institutions, or the goal should be to radically transform society. They may think the goal is for them to survive in a brutal economy, in a brutal society, the brutal society in which we're currently living. A lot of people these days obviously have bigger fish to fry, perhaps, or other fish to fry with regard to various problems that they might be dealing with. The second thing that I think could really be a disservice, I'm just going to stop and have a little sip.
Sure.
Another thing that I think is really important is colonialism. I've kind of mentioned this. I think that Canadians are more and more interested in what goes on in the world, which is great. And Canadians more and more, we see ourselves as kind of global citizens, and we want to get out there and do something about X, Y, and Z issue that we might see in some other continent, in some other country, or something that's going on internationally. And there is a big debate going on about gender and sexuality at the UN and through UN organizations. I think we see it in other international organizations, for example, in the establishment of the International Criminal Court, where there was a major debate about gender that directly touched on the question of sexual orientation, because some of the right-wing forces and some of the religious groups were opposed to the recognition of gender in the International Criminal Court over issues, for example, like forced rape as a weapon of war, rape as a weapon of war, or other gender violence as an issue in civil conflict, all issues that might be taken up in the International Criminal Court. So a lot of right-wing forces mobilized to prevent even the mentioning of the word gender around gender equality. And when you pushed out what were their reasons for opposing this, the reason was that they were afraid that using the word gender or using the word sex, they were very confused about gender, sex. They were worried that this could all lead to some kind of a queer thing. That was kind of the big thing that they were actually really concerned about. A lot of them didn't mind some protection of women in kind of a paternalistic way of protecting women and children, but they really didn't want strong gender rights in the International Criminal Court. So there was a battle between feminists, typical gender equality, liberal feminists, against this right-wing, force, and in the International Criminal Court. And we see the same thing in battles in the UN. We see a big discussion about sexuality in the UN and gender in the UN, with a multifaceted sort of conflict going on. And I think Canadian activists have to be careful in extending queer liberation to this level, because the issues are very complex, and there are many different cultures and cultural perspectives that are in play. And I think the one thing that we have to be really careful about is, basically establishing a colonial relationship between white activists and other activists throughout the world, activists of the South, activists of color, and I'm very uncomfortable with some of the activism that I've seen recently around this. I'm not sure whether mobilizing a campaign against the Ugandan government is a good thing or a bad thing. Now, people might think that that's pretty outrageous. Of course, it's bad, what the Ugandan government is doing to gay men and lesbians, and it's outrageous, and of course I agree that it is, and I don't want to see that happening, and I don't want to condone a government that behaves that way. But I think we have to ask ourselves as activists of the North what our role is, how we can play a role, and I think we have to be reflective. So to the extent that gay liberation extends itself to say, we're an international movement, a global movement, I think we have to be very careful not to reestablish colonial relationships or neo-colonial relationships within international and transnational LGBT organizing. And I think it's important to recognize that many different LGBTQ groups here in Toronto have strong relationships with a diaspora. You know, some of them are part of diaspora communities. Some of them have strong transnational links. You know, there are different examples. I mean, there are groups that have strong links to their homeland that they immigrated from. There are other groups that are part of, you know, Muslim groups, for example, that are part of the Muslim diaspora. So there are different models of that, and I think that it's important for white activists to consider these groups that are right here in our own city that are, and you know, many times white activists are very aware of that and do, you know, kind of bring those groups in. But I just think we have to be aware of replicating the sort of white dominance of today's LGBTQ movement and really thinking about that in particular with international organizing. Another example I would cite is EGAL's campaign on murder music that they carried out. I mean, I was very uncomfortable with that. Again, not because I'm a fan of, you know, violent rap music that advocates the killing of gay men, of course not. But because, again, I asked myself, what picture does this project of the LGBTQ movement in Canada when the leader of the largest organization sort of is approaching the top issue of the day being, you know, this type of music, when it really seems to set up a polarization between blacks and whites. I mean, you know, and I know that there were some in the African Canadian community who supported that and were involved in that campaign. But nonetheless, I think we have to ask of what is the perception and what is the political implication of that type of campaign. You know, it a bit reminds me of, you know, this is not the first time that white Canadians have been preaching, you know, to others, right? I mean, this is I think we have to recognize it in our history. We come from a history of holier than thou Protestantism in this province of Ontario. That's our political culture. That's our political tradition for many, many whites. We come from a background where, you know, whether we're aware of it or not, that's, you know, our background. You know, we've had the temperance movement. We've had all kinds of movements from moral regulation and, you know, Toronto the Good and cleaning up the city of Toronto. I mean, that's been a long-standing issue. And when I see this campaign on murder music, I a little bit feel that this is another campaign for moral purity. It's another campaign for moral regulation. It's another campaign that others, an entire community plays into white racism, which is alive and well in our city. And there I think we have to be very careful that campaigns like the Uganda campaign and the murder music campaign don't reinforce or aren't perceived to reinforce, you know, white racism against blacks, and against other groups of color, because that's a very, very important, you know, reality that we have to understand is out there, and that we have to, you know, be aware of. So I think we should be cautious with those campaigns, and I would tend to, you know, have those campaigns, you know, more have them led by people from those communities who are concerned about those issues, and where there are requests for assistance to which our organizations are perhaps responding. And some of that might have been the case with both of the campaigns that I mentioned.
And
but I still dislike them.
and this may link to the last question that you were hinting at a little earlier, and that is the last question that you chose, that is, what has been the most revolutionary new idea or theory that you see as important to our queer liberationist movement? And just to, I don't know if that's where you were getting at in terms of homo nationalism, or if you have other ideas in mind, but it's to you.
Yes, I think that homo nationalism is an important new idea. And that's a little bit what I was talking about with, for sure, with my comments about murder music and the Uganda campaign. At the same time, I think that Jasper Poor's specific work on homo nationalism cannot be applied simply to Canada. We are not the U.S. We are not a superpower. We have a different set of relationships around race that Americans have. Not to say we're not racist, quite to the contrary, but just racialization takes a different form here. And I think that a lot of the issues that Pilar raises in her book are, I think we just have to be careful in equating Canada with the U.S. I think we have to recognize the distinctiveness of each of these countries and recognize their distinctive legal and political structures that mean that these issues are sometimes articulated in different ways. I think there's some facile applications of homo nationalism to Canada that I think are not really helping the cause of of homo nationalism, because, if it's sloppily done, then it's not really convincing. So, and I guess the other big idea I think is out there that is really important is just everything that's happened around trans issues in the last 10 years. I mean, I would see that as by far the most important development, because of the fact that I think it's challenging traditional gay and lesbian identities. And I think lesbian identity in particular is in flux. And I think that different trans communities have played and are playing a role in that. And that's very important. I think that the rise of gender variance as an issue is not just around trans people and their different views of gender and gender transition, or the third gender, or the gender binary or not, and all those complex debates. But just in, as I say, the rise of the issue of gender variance in society, and especially the discussion that we're having around gender variance in children, which has really taken off just in the last 5 years. And I think these are some of the biggest issues that are happening, and I think it's an indication of shifting gender relations. I think there's a really foundational shift. I mean, the rise of a politicized trans movement is the canary in the mine shaft. I always say that, it's a canary in the mine shaft of broader changes in gender relations in our society, and I think something very big is going on that will foundationally challenge the definition of queer, because if we're going to organize queer around specific ideas about gender and sexuality, then the more gender variance, like the more, it's back to my point about the first definition of queer liberation. If the goal of queer liberation is to eradicate the line between queer and not queer, then I think that where the rise of the sort of politicization of the issue of gender variance is going to lead in a direction where mainstream society is going to have different ideas about gender. I mean, I think that that's happening, and it's going to happen. And the fact that there's this new generation of kids coming along articulating gender variance, and their parents are articulating gender variance, is very, very significant for queer liberation. Very significant. By far the most significant thing that's happened recently. Or it's not really a new idea, it's just a social development that I think is going to be very important. And a lot of those parents identify themselves as part of the queer movement. And so what is queer liberation going to look like when you have all these straight parents that are part of the movement? And they consider themselves to be part of the movement. I think it's very important. Perhaps that's news to Queer Ontario, but there's a whole constituency out there of parents of gender variant kids who consider themselves to be queer allies. And
We're part of a group that's very active in that.
yeah,
taking on
very
issues,
important.
And Danita's actually representing us on that group to look at that whole issue of gender variance.
No, you were just giving me an incredulous look, so I was like,
not just because of that one little piece there, but it's true, because we've seen some of these parents speaking in the media
totally.
who are straight identified, but they have such a queer sensibility to
Right.
them. It's fascinating to us. That's why I kind of reacted to think, like, she's really cool. Like, holy shit, having a mother that open-minded, like, it's like, wow.
Right, and that's kind of the question of, is queer liberation the transformation of society? And again, whether we want to be in the first camp of queer liberation or the second, as I defined it, it may be happening. It's like the activists with same-sex marriage. I mean, whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. And so what does that mean for a contained queer identity? There's always been the P flag thing and all that, but I think this is really different. Yeah, than just P flag or. Yeah. P flag is a precursor.
And P flag is embracing this as well. So
absolutely, it's in transformation.
It's evolving to
that would be a great PhD dissertation topic, by the way. Wouldn't that be a fantastic topic?
What, sorry?
The transformation of P flag.
Oh, yes.
That would be such an interesting topic to do a history of P flag.
Yeah.
And look at their different ideas about gender and sexual orientation over time and how they're in transition.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be so cutting edge. You can't put that on the tape.
Yes.
Don't get my permission. Copyright.
We're down to the last question that we ask everybody, and that is, given the discussion we've had, if there's any further thoughts, any ideas, anything that you want to comment on that you didn't get to chance to in this discussion.
No, I think we covered.
Maybe you could just make one comment on how do you think we're in a good time? Do you think that we have good things ahead?
Yeah. I think we're in a really dangerous time because of the economic crisis and the environmental crisis. I think we're in a really dangerous period, and yeah, I would be concerned that we're moving towards a society where there will be acceptance, increasing acceptance of the plasticity of gender and sexuality in ways that might look very liberatory compared to the old, the situation of 1971, but in the same time where that's accompanied by increasing social inequality, rampant social inequality actually, and highly racialized social inequality, and a decline in the quality of democratic political institutions, which I think we've already seen in Canada in the last 10 years or so, 20 years or so, and a lot of negative developments. So I think it would be possible for some aspects of queer liberation to succeed while our society fails.
Great. I do have another question. It slipped out of my mind, it just came back. Unless, you feel like you have,
No.
actually you don't. Okay, so I have a question is, it's come up with other interviewees, and you've hinted at it here and there in how your two-part definition of queer liberation. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts around queer theory, because when we first put this concept out there, like trying to hire for Davina, trying to hire for AJ, who's the RA, not here, but was probably communicating with you to get you here. People who were responding, and even when I mention this to people out there, they hear queer liberation, queer to them immediately jumps to queer theory. And do you see a link between queer theory and queer liberation? Yes or no?
Well,
and how do you just, I'll let you just take that where you want.
Okay, so what is the link between queer theory and queer liberation?
If there is one.
If there is one, yes. Well, I think queer theory was an academic movement in the humanities. It had some translation into activism in the sense of groups like Queer Nation, which actually were quite short-lived in Canada. And it's interesting, an interesting move in the humanities, and I think it really is highlighting that idea, the central idea, that of Butler, of gender as performative, which I think is a very important idea. I don't think it's a new idea, because I think it was there in gay liberation, but it was elaborated certainly in queer theory in all kinds of new and rich directions. And yes, I think it has something to do with queer liberation, because it's really the justification for, or not justification, but the, how could I put it? Queer theory provides an intellectual rationale for queer liberation. It provides an intellectual, I guess I can say intellectual justification for queer liberation. But with regard to the central ideas of the plasticity of gender and sexuality. However, at the same time, I think queer theory is a very elite movement. It's not only elite in the sense that it's an elite idea because it's been put forward and elaborated by academics, and mainly by people situated in the university and in a position of privilege, therefore, but also it's been put forward by some of the most privileged people within, even among academics, by the most privileged academics, not necessarily an idea put forth or an idea that is translated to students at big universities that are outside of the elite. Again, I would, if I was looking at the U.S. context, I would see queer theory as something that was kind of elaborated at Berkeley, some of the Ivy League schools, and I wouldn't see it as something that we find out at a state college or a state U somewhere. So even within academia, it was a minority taste, and it was in a privileged position among humanities departments. I also think it was problematic because queer theory often was equated with queer studies. And therefore, if you weren't engaging with queer theory, you weren't really doing queer studies. So those of us who wanted to do history, politics, law, and look at LGBTQ topics, there kind of was a problem, an intellectual problem in putting forth some of these other approaches to, which I think are very important. Obviously, I think they're very important since that's what I do. But I think that it was always a challenge because queer theory sort of stood in our way. We didn't want to be Butler. We didn't have, we didn't want to write about gender performativity. We wanted to write about whether or not, a gal won such and such of a court case and what are the implications for how government policy might change, which are issues that are of concern to queer liberation generally. I think a lot of what Queer Ontario does is actually lobbying the provincial government around, different types of needs for queer communities. So having that type of information available is important. And I think with regard to the two different definitions of queer liberation that I gave, the queer theory, well, as I say, it gives us the idea of the plasticity of gender, but it doesn't really speak to the two because it could fit in with either. Either queer theory could be about how we want to transform society. So there's a greater recognition of, say, gender fluidity, as in the example of, increased recognition of gender variance, for example. Or queer theory could be our, the justification, the intellectual justification for let's retrench into our communities and defend our queer identity. I think it could, go either way. It's not really providing any guidance either way. And I see queer theory as being really divorced from the, dare I say, practical world of, sort of pragmatic politics. And I think it's the ideas are really important. I don't mean to diminish that because I think they are. But I also think queer theory became a hegemon that marginalized other forms of queer scholarship about queers, and that can marginalize other identities within queer liberation. After all, if we do believe gender is completely performative, then we might also marginalize and deny the reality of people who truly feel, for example, gender dysphoric and truly want to transition, or, to just say, well, your gender is just whatever it is when you wake up in the morning, while the person's taking hormones and, going through this whole transition could be, marginalizing for them just to be told, have, the elite academics hand waved at them like, it's just the gender performance of the day or whatever. So I think that queer theory also has the potential to marginalize particular types of issues.
Okay, that's great. I didn't have anything else myself. Anything further?
I've been so hard done by.
Thank you so much. That was really, really good. That was great.
Good.
We're out of time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Well,